enemy of society would try to save those men from the gallows. In the face of the warning, three courageous members of the bar, who hitherto had only handled civil cases, agreed to undertake the defense. William P. Black was the chief among these. A captain in the Union Army during the Civil War, he was known as a fighter, tall, dark, and handsome, with a pronounced jaw that shook a short beard. He was often the center of all eyes in the court. Assistant Black was William A. Foster, said to be a capable finder of evidence, and Sigismund Zeisler, an earnest and studious young man with a blond Van Dyke beard, red lips, and wavy hair. On the other side of this desperate contest was Grinnell, the state's attorney, who was understood to aspire for the governor's office, and several assistants whose names got into print much less than Grinnell's. He had a fresh, healthy face and a big, well-curled mustache. All the defendants were neatly dressed. They sat in the chairs with dignity and with the elegant self-assurance of men who expected to be exonerated if they got justice. There was a breathless tension in the court proceedings. The air electric. Grinnell talked much about protecting society and government against enemies who want their destruction. Captain Black was often on his feet with objections. But back at the Evening Mall office, I redrew my sketches on chalk plates. By the time I had acquired a ready knack for working with this process, though I never liked it, these pictures of trial attracted considerable attention, both among the male staff and outside. Word came to me a little later that Melville Stone, editor of the Daily News, had commented favorably upon that day's work of mine. Having attended a few sessions of the trial, and in a sense having been for several days part of a dramatic spectacle, I followed the newspaper reports of the case with much interest. Evidence steadily mounted against them. Of the quality of that evidence, I knew nothing, nor did I for years afterwards. Immediately after the verdict, the defense gave notice that it would appeal to the higher courts, and with this convicted men locked in their cells in the county jail, the press began devoting its front page to other affairs. I was to see more of the class struggle in the near future without knowing what it meant. Indeed, at that time I was 20 years old. I knew hardly anything, except that I had a knack for drawing pictures and was pretty good at reciting books from poetry, reciting verses from books of poetry. Basically, they get turned down numerous times, and Judge Gary sentenced the 7 men in the county jail to die there on November 11th. This left them only 9 days to live at this point. Defense committee began circulating petitions addressed to Governor Dick Oglesby, urging commutation to life in terms of in the penitentiary. Many prominent individuals wrote the chief executive to that end, and various delegations visited him on behalf of the doomed men. It is apparent now that the sentiment concerning the anarchists had changed a good deal. Appeals on their behalf were signed by notables. So basically during the trial, all these folks were all young men, except for a guy named Fielden. Even the beard worn by Schwab and Ling's mustache could not disguise their youthfulness. Now the word came in an explosion that Ling had put a bomb in his mouth and lighted a fuse and was dying. Let's see. So basically, at this point, it was a doomed case. But people were starting to see that this was a hysterical event, and so at the end of this, at the end of this trial, if we want to call it that. They got found guilty. It quickly went up to the state Supreme Court, went up to the Supreme Court, the National Supreme Court, and they said, we're not going to hear it. You can go ahead and do it. And it's a miscarriage of justice because, again, in order for them to have been convicted, this is what they would have needed to find. Now, I'm not a criminal attorney. I'm just playing one on this podcast. But I would think, and just logically speaking, is that they would have needed to find, for instance, they found some sort of bomb-making residue, which it would later come to find out that the detective who had found that had to step aside because of the difficulties. It was placed on administrative leave because of his conduct during the investigation when he badly missed on several pieces of the legislation. These folks were thinking that, hey, look, this was, it couldn't possibly go this way. This is craziness. There's no way that it's so threadbare. We didn't try to kill anyone. There's no way we can get convicted for this. And it's clear that there was. And this trial was trying to be done speedily because it wasn't about, to the newspaper people, it wasn't about whether they did or not. It was about destroying the anarchists and destroying the labor movement. And for people, I'm not, for people, keep in mind that there were riots and issues going on at different points all throughout the country. And the divide between police and labor at this point was pretty severe. So, I kind of wanted to go with this. This is, we've been talking a lot about August Spies, but let's actually hear from his own words what he thought about it. And I'm going to try to spread around and try to get to the gist of it. On the evening of May 4th, 1886, a meeting was called in Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest the killing of 4 strikers at the McCormick Harvester Works the day before. It was a peaceful meeting and had dwindled from several thousand to a few hundred when a detachment of 180 policemen asked the crowd to disperse. The speaker said that the meeting was almost over, and then a bomb exploded in the midst of the police, wounding 66 policemen, of whom 7 later died. The police fired in the crowd, killing several people, wounding 200. Although there was no evidence of who threw the bomb, 8 Chicago anarchists were tried, sentenced to death. This became known worldwide as the Haymarket Affair. Oh, I apologize. I'm actually reading the wrong thing. I'm actually reading this is what happens when you record a bunch of podcasts in a row. Here's the actual words. Your Honor, in addressing the court, I speak as the representative of one class to the representative of another. I will begin with the words uttered 500 years ago on a similar occasion by the Venetian Doge Ferrari, who, addressing the court, said, "My defense is your accusation, the causes of my alleged crime, your history. I have been indicted on a charge of murder as an accomplice or accessory. Upon this indictment, I have been convicted. There is no evidence produced by the state to show or even indicate that I had any knowledge of the man who threw the bomb or that I myself had anything to do with the throwing of the missile. Unless, of course, you weigh the testimony of the accomplices of the state's attorney and Bonfield and the testimony of Thompson and Gilmer by the price they were paid for it. If there was no evidence to show that I was legally responsible for the deed, then my conviction and execution of the sentence is nothing less than willful, malicious, and deliberate murder. As foul a murder as may be found in the annals of religious, political, or any other sort of persecution. There may have been many judicial murders committed where the representatives of the state were acting in good faith, believing their victims to be guilty of the charge accused of. In this case, the representatives of the state cannot shield themselves with a similar excuse, for they themselves have fabricated most of the testimony, which was used as a pretense to convict us by a jury picked out to convict. Before this court and before the public, which is supposed to be the state, I charge the state's attorney in Bonfield with a heinous conspiracy to commit murder. I will state a little incident that may throw light upon this charge. On the evening on which the Praetorian Guards of the Citizens Association, the Bankers Association, the Association Board of Trademen, and the Railroad Princess attacked the meeting of working men on the Haymarket with murderous intent, on that evening, about 8 o'clock, I met a young man, Legner by name, who is a member of the Aurora Turnverein. He accompanied me and never left me on that evening until I jumped from the wagon a few seconds before the explosion occurred. He knew that I had not seen Schwab that evening. He knew that I had no such conversation with anybody, as Mr. Marshall's protege Thompson can testify to. He knew that I did not jump from the wagon to strike the match and hand it to the man who threw the bomb. He is not a socialist. Why did we not bring him on the stand? Because the honorable representatives of the state, Grinnell and Bonfield, spirited him away. These honorable gentlemen knew everything about Legner. They knew that his testimony would prove the perjury of Thompson and Gilmer beyond any reasonable doubt. Legner's name was on the list of witnesses for the state. He was not called, however, for obvious reasons. He stated to a number of friends that he had been offered $500 if he would leave the city and threatened with direful things if he remained here, and appeared as a witness for the defense. So I'm going to stop there. It is absolutely pretty clear that it was just a kangaroo court. And I bring that up to say that this miscarriage of justice would eventually become a rallying cry. Eventually these folks, when they would be hung, were looked upon as martyrs for the 8-hour day. So when you go to work or you have to pull an overtime shift, and you have to do anything, or your boss says, "Oh, I can't afford overtime. You need to go home." These are the people that you need to thank who absolutely made this all happen. If it wasn't for them, none of this goes in any particular way. You don't have the 8-hour day today. These people paid for it with blood, with their lives. The trial, in the years after this trial takes place, pardon would come, a pardon too late. On June 26, 1893, Illinois Governor John Peter Atgeld, the progressive governor of Illinois, himself a German immigrant, signed pardons for Fielden, Neeb, and Schwab, calling them the victims of hysteria, packed juries, and a biased judge. And knowing that the state has never discovered who it was that threw the bomb which killed the policeman, and the evidence does not show any connection whatsoever between the defendants and the man who threw it. Atgeld also faulted the city of Chicago for failing to hold the Pinkerton Guards for repeated use of lethal violence against striking workers. Altgeld's actions concerning labor was used to defeat his re-election. So that's basically how the world stands. Again, the panic that happened gave rise to the American Federation of Labor. It sent everyone for those 2 months into an absolute scramble. Because essentially the bosses had the upper hand, the police had the upper hand. They could go into any home for any reason if you were suspected of being a labor person, and they would use it much like we would see in other countries where an excuse would be made to persecute people. And this has all the hallmarks of it. It must not be lost on folks also that these folks were German. Many of them had just moved into the country, and it was a very easy thing to do to make them monstrous. These weren't British people, so if any of the defendants got up to speak, they sounded and did in a German voice, which is, in so many movies, a German voice is used as the typical bad guy. So this, I guess when I think about this, though, the good news is that the 8-hour workday would eventually get signed. At this point, unless you are excluded, you work over 8 hours or you work over more than 40 hours a week, you get overtime pay. And that overtime pay is meant to penalize the boss and the employer for not staffing correctly. And it's meant so that you have, if you pull your shift, you should have 8 hours, 8 hours pay, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. So that's kind of a cool concept. So I'm going to finish this podcast by just saying this, is that, when we look back on this period and this time in labor history, this was the Big Bang of labor. The AFL gets started out of it, but also the distinctions and splits that still exist today. Anarchists tend to reject passionately, not completely, but they tend to reject passionately anything that has to do with the labor movement. They tend not to want to be part of anything and feel that the labor movement is too stodgy and slow. Communists tend to chafe a little bit with anarchists, in the sense that anarchists want immediate gratification, want to do things immediately. Might not always be the best strategic folks. And again, these are very broad generalities. I'm not trying to say that this is true all the way around. And then the labor unionists hate both because they feel that both thumb their nose at the government and could get everybody in trouble someday. But all these distinctions were definitely underneath the surface. They begin at this point, and it's one of the major driving issues for working people today is their ability to get together and work together and make it all happen. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this podcast. I want to thank you for hanging in there on the Big Bang of Labor. We're going to figure out who to do next, and we'll move forward. Thanks.